Ich finde es unerhört, moralisch.
I find it outrageous, morally, politically, and on a human level, that a state which has perfected the technology of targeted killing can simply take out the leadership elite of another country. If Iran actually ends up emerging as the winner, that would be a powerful, almost unimaginable blow to U.S. power, and it would mark a major step towards speeding up the formation of a multipolar world order.
Herausbildung der multipolaren Weltordnung.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Against the Current. About the guest. Welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to ignore. One blind spot of the so-called quality media is geopolitics, the rivalry among the great powers, the role of the United States as a superpower, as the only superpower for many years. Yet it's precisely these great powers that determine questions of war and peace, and ultimately the fate of Germany as well. One person who has analyzed these issues is Professor Mohssen Massarat. He taught at the University of Osnabrück and has now published a book with Pro Media in Vienna titled Anatomy of U.S. Hegemony. That's what we'll be talking about today. Hello, Professor Massarat. Good day, Mr. Bob. You begin your book with the sentence, "The current world order is in deep crisis." Why?
Die Weltordnung befindet sich in einer tiefen Krise. Wieso? Weil die Vereinigten
Because the United States is gradually losing the hegemonic power it's been used to over the past 30 or 40 years, as a very significant rival has emerged. An economic rival, namely the People's Republic of China. That's why a situation has developed in the U.S. that's hard for us to comprehend, one that ultimately brought someone like Donald Trump to the presidency. He now looks at the world and reacts to these changes in a rather nervous way, a completely irrational behavior.
ein völlig irrationales Verhalten, aber das zeigt auch, das ist Ausdruck der Krise.
But that also shows this is exactly what I mean by a crisis, the loss of power of the United States and the beginning of a new phase where conflicts will almost become part of everyday life. We can see that especially in the war with Iran. That event is closely connected to the global crisis and above all to the crisis of the U.S. as a hegemonic power. We can go into more detail about that later, but first I'd like to thank you for inviting me.
Ihnen als erstes danken, dass Sie mich eingeladen haben.
Gladly, you're an interesting person to talk to as well. A question about Donald Trump. Well, in a way,
Der italienische Philosoph Antonio Gramsci hat gesagt, in Zeiten des Interregnums, in Zeiten des Übergangs, wo die alte Weltordnung abtritt, aber die neue noch in ihren Geburtswehen liegt, das ist die Zeit der Monster. Erkennen Sie das in Donald Trump?
In gewisser Weise schon. Also, wenn man
So, when you look at how reckless, how ruthless, how chaotic, how egomaniacal, how completely self-centered his reactions to everything in the world are, you can definitely see what Gramsci was talking about, reflected in Donald Trump.
in Donald Trump entdecken, ja.
Und Donald Trump,
and Donald Trump, together with Israel, has attacked Iran. In your view, what does this illegal war of aggression reveal?
völkerrechtswidrigen Angriffskrieg.
Hier kommen viele Aspekte.
A lot of different factors come together here, and almost all of them, well, not all, but almost all, are connected to politics, to the way the United States, as a hegemonic power, has dealt with the rest of the world. In this war, Israel appears not only as the military arm of the U.S. in the Middle East, but it also plays a very important role. The Middle East isn't just any region of the world. It's the region where a large share of the world's oil reserves are found, reserves that are especially cheap to extract. The natural productivity of those oil fields is very high. The U.S. itself also has a lot of oil, but its production costs are much higher.
Produktionskosten sind besonders hoch, also
So, the Middle East plays a very important role, and Israel has become the military arm of the United States. Since the founding of the State of Israel, the U.S. has gradually realized that Israel could be a very important military, but also political ally for its hegemonic policy. Because controlling the countries that have those oil resources can't be done by Washington alone. The U.S. needs a junior partner in the region, one that, as Friedrich Merz said last year in connection with the 12-Day War, is a junior partner that does the dirty work, so to speak, for us, for the West, and especially for the United States. Israel's main objective there is to prevent the oil-producing countries, so not just them alone, but together with the United States, from forming a strong bloc that could control everything related to the global oil economy and draw the greatest benefit from it. That would be the case if we had a free, truly free world economy, where the oil states could sell their oil on the world market without U.S. military intervention. Such a bloc could actually bring stability both to the region and to the global economy, and it would have many positive aspects. I'll just say it plainly: climate protection. We'd be dealing with climate protection in a completely different way, especially how we manage it, if the oil-producing countries were able to act rationally as a bloc, based on economic principles. But they weren't able to do that. Even before Israel became a junior partner of the United States, the U.S., at the beginning of the 20th century, made sure that against all economic logic, oil from those countries, something you probably know, though most people probably don't, was bought for just $2 a barrel. It was sold by multinational corporations that had acquired rights there, rights of a neo-colonial nature. So the United States has been trying since the beginning of this century to use oil as a very important political tool. And throughout history, they've gone through different stages in the oil sector and the crises that came with it. For example, back in 1973, countries in that region started raising the oil price from $2 to $10. That triggered a global economic crisis. Later, we reached another stage when those countries were able to push the price up to $40. And after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the oil price even climbed at times to $100. That's about 50 times higher than before. The United States has repeatedly tried to find new ways to economically dominate what's happening in the oil sector, against all the rules of a free market. They've worked to control and regulate the amount of oil being produced, to shape it in their favor, and to make sure there's always more oil available on the world markets so that prices go down. They've tried again and again to set a price level that fits their own hegemonic interests. It's a very complex issue, historically, a very complex one, where the U.S. has kept finding new allies to support its policies. And for the past 30 or 40 years, Israel has been the most important military partner in carrying out that strategy and maintaining as much control as possible over developments in the oil sector.
So who actually pulled whom into the current war against Iran? Was it Israel pulling the United States in, or the United States pulling Israel?
These two states are each hegemonic powers, the United States on a global scale, and Israel because of its nuclear capability, even though Israel has not officially acknowledged it so far. But Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East, and at the same time, it sees itself as a hegemon, a military power and a political hegemon in the region. Both powers often share common goals, but they also have different visions. Israel's goal, according to Zionist ideas, is a territorially expansive one, and we can see that since its founding, Israel has consistently pursued a policy of expansion. And the goal that the new leaders in the Israeli cabinet are pursuing, the Jewish right-wing radicals, the evangelicals, in the Trump cabinet, there's this idea of creating a greater Israel, stretching from Baghdad to Cairo. That's the long-term Zionist goal that Israel is systematically working toward, while making sure the world doesn't really see this underlying intention, this hegemonic, expansionist, and aggressive intention. But step by step, that's the direction it's moving in. That, in fact, is Israel's real goal. And for that goal, Iran stands as a major obstacle. That's what explains Israel's ideas or ambitions regarding Iran, namely, to weaken Iran as much as possible, to break it up into many regions, each assigned to different ethnic groups within the country. So the idea is to break up the nation-state of Iran, like what happened to Yugoslavia, into many small states that would be powerless against Israel. That's Israel's goal. The United States, on the other hand, wants Iran to fully submit to American hegemonic power, in line with its policy of completely controlling the economic dynamics of the oil sector. That's the U.S. goal in relation to Iran. All the states along the Persian Gulf have gradually submitted to this American demand. You could say that the Gulf states, if not outright colonies, are at least neo-colonies, states that cooperate with the U.S. under neo-colonial conditions. Iran, however, has always tried to stay out of that process, to keep its distance. In 1953, there was a coup against Mossadegh, because Mossadegh, who was then the democratically elected head of government, the first prime minister ever elected democratically in Iran, maybe even in the entire Middle East, had nationalized the Iranian oil industry. That meant bringing the country's oil sector under Iranian control and aligning it with national interests, instead of the neo-colonial interests of the United States when it came to production levels and price regulation. After that coup, there were 25 years of a Western-backed regime. This regime, under Shah Reza Pahlavi, completely submitted to U.S. interests, became totally dependent, and was in many ways a state similar to Saudi Arabia. Today, of course, there are a number of differences, but in its relationship with the United States, it functions in a way that's similar to Saudi Arabia. After the Islamic Revolution, Iran pulled out of those neo-colonial relationships the U.S. had with the country, and since then, it's been seen as a disruptive factor. From that point on, there's been a Cold War, sometimes even a hot one. The Cold War has taken the form of sanctions, systematic sanctions. Iran is the most heavily and intensely sanctioned country in the world. Maybe before Russia, maybe after Russia, that's debatable, but it's definitely one of the most sanctioned. And the purpose of sanctions is to eventually lead to war. When sanctions don't achieve the desired result, war follows. And this war, and yes, that feeling of being under attack, we've had that again and again since 2001, since 2003. George W. Bush kept threatening Iran with war, and there have been a lot of wars in that context since then. Iran is basically the last one left on that list. Most of the so-called troublemakers, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Assad in Syria, those troublemakers have all been taken out. Now it's Iran's turn. But to your question, I went a bit off track, but I haven't forgotten it. Everything points to the fact that Netanyahu has been claiming for 20 years that Iran is on the verge of becoming a nuclear power. He himself leads a nuclear power, yet he keeps accusing a country that does have a nuclear program, but no nuclear bomb. The country has been said to be just about to build a nuclear bomb for 20 years now. And it's become clear that Netanyahu has tried to pull every U.S. president into a war over it. Only Donald Trump was willing to fall for Netanyahu's story. Yes, you could probably force regime change in Iran pretty quickly, through destruction, through the assassination of top politicians, through stirring up the population. That's a plan the Mossad has been developing for quite some time, but it completely ignores reality. It's based on stories, so to speak, that may have sounded rational inside the Israeli cabinet, but were totally unrealistic.
Völlig irreal war. Also man kann sagen, Netanyahu.
You could say that Netanyahu succeeded in convincing Trump that the Iranian regime would be an easy target, especially now, after the domestic crisis in Iran became visible earlier this year, in January, during those large demonstrations where, unfortunately, many people were killed. And it has to be said that apparently Mossad and CIA agents, through provocations within those protests, and by trying to steer them toward their own goals, contributed to the government's reaction, the military and police response, being much harsher than before. That's why the number of deaths was so high. So the atmosphere, the situation at the beginning of this year, seemed almost tailor-made for Netanyahu to launch a war of aggression, an offensive war.
Aggressionskrieg für einen Angriffskrieg. Und wir haben gesehen,
and we've seen that both of them, once they decided to follow this pattern of first wiping out the elite. Let me say a word about that. I find it outrageous, morally, politically, and on a human level, that a state which has developed the technology of targeted killing with such precision is able to simply shoot down the leadership of another country just because those politicians manage a system that goes against its own interests. That would be like Putin developing such a technology in Russia and then using it to assassinate German politicians like Friedrich Merz, Mr. Waterful, and others, arguing that these politicians are responsible for the war in Ukraine continuing.
Noch weiter fortgesetzt wird. Das ist durchaus vergleichbar.
That's definitely comparable. An image like that is similar to what Israel has been systematically doing for years, not only against Palestinians, but now also applying on a higher level against Iran. That's outrageous. It's outrageous that politicians like Friedrich Merz and EU officials say nothing about it, that they stay silent. I can hardly describe how this kind of normalization, Israel carrying out targeted killings, makes such actions seem normal, and what consequences that could have for relations, for international relations. This kind of normalization is unacceptable in that context. It must not be accepted. And I'm honestly surprised that people are just letting it happen.
Why have the two aggressors failed in Iran so far?
Sie haben sich verrechnet.
They miscalculated. Trump believed that Iran was more or less comparable to Venezuela. In Venezuela, he had some success. He arrested the country's leader and managed to influence the next generation of the Venezuelan elite to the point where they were willing to accommodate U.S. interests. That was driven by the same interest in the oil sector. But what they overlooked is that Iran has a completely different history. Iran is a cultural nation, a civilization that's been around for more than 2,000 years. It's been through many wars, world wars, invasions by the Mongols. First Alexander invaded Iran, then the Mongols, then the Arabs. Through all of that, Iran has endured and survived as a nation with its own culture and its own language. Behind all this, you could say there's a kind of capital, a capital of resistance. You can see it in the fact that right now, even people like me, who criticize the government, who criticize the Islamic government, have shown more support for it during the war. By now, about 29 million, mostly men, I think, are ready to take part in the war, to defend Iran. All of this points to something that isn't visible, but it's there. A bond between the government and the people in Iran. That's been completely overlooked. People assumed that, because of the Islamic Republic's misguided policies toward its own population, they could exploit the divisions in the country and overthrow the government. In my view, that's the main reason both sides have misjudged the situation.
Aber die Vereinigten Staaten.
But the United States has also failed militarily so far, because Iran has managed to hit the West and the Gulf states at their most vulnerable points, using relatively cheap and low-cost weapon systems. Yes.
Ja, da haben Sie völlig recht.
You're absolutely right about that. Iran knows it, and Iranian politicians, the media, scientists, and intellectuals have known for 20 years that a major war against Iran could come, either from the United States alone or from the U.S. together with Israel. That was no secret. That's why, apparently, and this actually surprised me, the Revolutionary Guards, who were recently put on the EU Parliament's list of terrorist organizations, have been labeled that way. We're talking about an army here, a strong army that came out of the revolution. Putting them on that list is part of the West's misjudgment, one of those serious mistakes in Western policy. But that's just a side note. The Revolutionary Guards have clearly found some very smart advisors. They grew through the 8-year Iran-Iraq War and learned a great deal militarily. And they've built a strong base in the economy as well.
Große Basis gewonnen. Sie sind
They're there with their families. That's more than 2 million people altogether, a really large group. They've identified so strongly with the Islamic Republic and with Iran as a country that they've prepared themselves to defend it in the event of a war. Defense here mainly means a strategy of asymmetric warfare. That's clear. When you know you're facing the world's biggest military power, you can still defend your country by choosing other strategies that actually work. And that's what asymmetric warfare is about. As far as I can tell, Iran's military-industrial complex hasn't focused on developing aircraft, but rather on developing missiles.
Sondern auf die Entwicklung von Raketen, weil sie gesagt haben,
because they said, if you can gain a technological advantage, then do it in that field, not in aircraft. So they took a different route, and that's probably the key factor. With rockets, with those highly precise missiles of various ranges, hidden all over the country, underground, they managed to keep them protected. And now, even after 5 weeks of war, about 60 to 70% of their capacity apparently still exists. They're less vulnerable than the other side. The other side relies on aircraft carriers, on large planes, and maybe soon on ground troops. All of that is visible. And that visible power can be attacked by an invisible, effective power, which at least so far has brought the United States a clear military defeat.
Und das ist nur möglich,
And that's only possible because the Iranian rockets and drones are hitting their targets with great precision. And that, in turn, is only possible thanks to satellite intelligence, provided, for example, by China. You mentioned China as the main competitor of the United States. What role is Beijing playing in this conflict?
Also rein theoretisch.
So in theory, you could say it's in the interest of the New World Order, one in which the People's Republic of China will play an important role. If Iran comes out ahead in this war against the United States, if the U.S. is pushed out of the Middle East militarily, if the oil sector and the countries in the region start to take a different path, especially if they join forces and try to build a shared security framework in the Persian Gulf, then they could pursue their own common strategy, one that runs counter to the interests of Israel and the United States. If that process takes place, it would have a huge impact on completely different areas I've analyzed in detail in the book as well, namely the role of the dollar, the petrodollar. The petrodollar plays a special role for the United States, for the military-industrial complex, for funding the arms industry, and for financing U.S. wars, hundreds of them. The petrodollar is crucial because it allows the U.S. not to finance those wars itself, but to have the rest of the world pay for them.
Also der Petrodollar bedeutet,
So the petrodollar means that oil and gas are mostly traded in dollars. That's why the whole world needs dollars to buy oil and gas. So the United States can print unlimited amounts of dollars, export its inflation, take on endless debt, and use that to finance its military complex. Is that correct?
ihren Militärkomplex finanzieren. Ist das richtig?
So ist es. Sie haben es sehr richtig beschrieben.
Exactly. You've described it very accurately. The mechanism behind it is debt, specifically the creation of U.S. government bonds by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve issues these bonds and sells them to the world, offering relatively high returns. The world buys them with petrodollars, and capital from all over flows into the United States as purchasing power. Through this inflow of capital, money that comes into the country without any effort on their part, the United States can finance wars, the arms industry, and the federal budget, all without having to raise taxes for defense or warfare. That's a crucial point. The American public's support for the government's entire policy of aggression and militarization is tied to the fact that they don't feel any economic burden from it.
Hat damit zu tun, dass sie ökonomisch nicht belastet werden. Die Regierung finanzieren alle diese Kriege.
Governments are financing all these wars through debt, with money coming in from all over the world. That's why the United States, it's the only country with the highest level of debt, keeps expanding that debt through ongoing wars. $40 trillion, or 40,000 billion, that's unimaginable, and it keeps growing. The U.S. can continue borrowing and funding wars. This, in turn, is based on the fact that the oil-producing countries, almost all of them, have submitted to the rule of trading oil in dollars. Only Iran hasn't. Since the Islamic Revolution, Iran has refused to follow that rule. Because of sanctions, Iran is even forced to sell its oil to China and settle those transactions in yuan.
Und das in Yuan abzurechnen. Alle anderen Staaten haben sich diesem Diktat.
All the other countries have bowed to this dictate. You can see how the dollar, the petrodollar, and the neo-colonial relationships with the oil states are all connected. Iran committed what's seen as the greatest sin of all, staying out of that system and working against it. That's what we're seeing here, so to speak. You asked about China's role. It's in the interest of the People's Republic of China if Iran ultimately comes out on top. That would be a powerful, almost unimaginable blow to U.S. power, and it would mark a major step, a real acceleration toward the emergence of a multipolar world order. Beijing.
Der multipolaren Weltordnung.
Peking bezieht Öl aus dem Iran. Der Iran verkauft.
It gets its oil from Iran. Iran sells a large share of its oil to China. In turn, China gets about 20% of its oil from Iran. At the same time, Iran is a key hub for the Belt and Road project heading west. So can Beijing really afford to let Iran go?
Kann es sich Peking leisten, den Iran fallen zu lassen?
Rational glaube ich nicht.
Rationally, I don't think so. Beijing has been systematically pursuing a policy of closer ties with Iran, and there's a fairly close political relationship between the so-called values-oriented, or you could also say the principalists, within the Iranian system. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of that system, has been a strong advocate of this close relationship with China. But the problem is that the body of Iranian society and its economy are oriented in a completely different direction, toward the West. And that's the dilemma. That's also Iran's Achilles heel, because there are two camps that don't speak with one voice.
Mit einer Stimme sprechen. Die Pastoran und die politische Elite.
The Pastoran and the political elite have realized that Iran has a chance to survive as an independent state only if it doesn't submit to the dictates of the United States and Israel. But that awareness is also a problem, at least for part of society. And that's my issue with Iran as well, because the country's economy is built on a mercantilist system, a rule of merchants and wholesalers. They live off imports, not off production, development, or industrialization. And that, essentially, has been the main weakness of Iran's economy over the past 20 years. It's also the key reason why real prosperity hasn't developed in Iran.
ein Wohlstand im Iran nicht entsteht, wenn Beschäftigung nicht entsteht durch industrielle
If jobs don't come from industrialization, then there's no real prosperity. Trade only makes the traders rich, not society as a whole. And the part of society that's focused on trade, the Chamber of Commerce, that's actually the center of control over Iran's politics and economy, over government policy, not the policy of the Revolutionary Guards or the ideological elite. That's why the West can keep pointing to this group, supporting it within Iranian society. And the other way around, this group looks to the United States and constantly develops plans and strategies aimed at adjustment, at submission. So Iran also has its own social and political problem.
Politisches Problem.
So the strategy of the hegemon, the United States, to subjugate other countries can only work if it finds local allies within those countries. That's how it is.
So ist es. Und das Ringen im
And the struggle inside Iran itself is really about this question. Whether the mercantilists, I call them the wholesalers, because they try to use the power of the Islamic government for their own purposes, whether they prevail. I describe that as a mercantilist system. These mercantilists are trying to undermine the relationship with China. China signed a framework agreement with Iran about 10 years ago, but not a single article of that agreement has been implemented to this day, especially the construction of the east-west and north-south railways, which are part of the Silk Road. The corridor you just mentioned also needs to be brought to life. That means roads have to be built here. And above all, rail lines have to be expanded.
Hier müssen vor allem Schienen ausgebaut werden. Das steht alles in dem Rahmenabkommen, aber keine dieser.
All of that is laid out in the framework agreement. But none of those agreements have actually been implemented because the mercantilist, Western-oriented camp systematically undermined and blocked them. So it's not just a question of how China views Iran. It's also about how the social forces within Iran see the world and which path they want to take. Do they want to stay within this system of a unilateral world order, support it, align themselves with the United States through sanctions? Or do they want to move toward a new world order, one without a hegemonic power, where the major powers build cooperative relationships with each other, and none of them hold a dominant position, whether militarily or financially?
Weder militärisch noch finanziell haben.
Das ist ein Aspekt, auf den US-Präsident Donald Trump.
That's one point U.S. President Donald Trump mentioned on his Truth Social channel. He said, "We're continuing the blockade, the naval blockade. Iran is politically divided. Let's see what happens." Is that what he's counting on?
Ist es das, worauf setzt?
Ich glaube ja. Ich glaube ja.
I think so, yes. I really do. What looks chaotic to us is actually a strategy. We tend to say, Trump is erratic, Trump is irrational, and that's true. But Trump isn't America. The deep state in America is alive and working. Now, Trump wants to completely control that deep state. There's a struggle going on there, one that we can't easily see. But overall, no matter which direction the presidents take, they and the deep state share one goal: to prevent China from becoming a successful economic rival in building a new world order. One where the United States is just one great power among others, no longer holding all those unique military and economic advantages, and certainly not at the expense of the rest of the world. That's something the system, the U.S. system, does not want.
Will das System, das US-System nicht. Da sind alle sich einig. Trump.
Everyone agrees on this. Trump has his own way of doing things. For example, in the conflict with Iran, he tries to create uncertainty, confusion, and fear. That's typical for Trump. He negotiates only through threats. That means he's developed a new strategy for the U.S. role in the region, one that's different from how previous administrations governed. Earlier, U.S. governments did negotiate in conflicts, deliberately and directly, but he's using a risky approach, and that could actually push him to take actions. And that's what worries me. Actions he keeps hinting at in his threats, like the possible use of nuclear weapons. He builds that up again and again, and I think at some point he might feel he has to follow through just to keep his word. So far, though, he hasn't carried out any of those threats.
Seine derartige Drohung nicht wahrgemacht. Aber wer weiß?
But who knows? Trump said, I'll bomb Iran back to the Stone Age where it belongs. I'll destroy a civilization. Is that the language of fascism?
Substanziell ja.
Substantially, yes. You can't hold such an idea based on any moral principles, let alone say it out loud. The people who think that way are usually dictators or authoritarian types. But when a president says something like that, you really have to admit, that's a whole new level. I honestly believe that Trump himself would be a prototype for a fascist system. Thankfully, America as a system isn't fascist yet. But in my view, Trump and his supporters definitely show fascist traits. You can see that in many ways. And what I've seen from how ICE operates against migrants in the U.S., that's basically more than apartheid. It's almost fascism, what's happening in parts of the country. The real question is whether the other forces still present in the U.S., those who vote democratically and still uphold human rights, whether they're strong enough to resist that process.
Diesen Prozess zu wieder.
Sie haben vom tiefen Staat gesprochen. Damit bezeichnen
You've talked about the deep state. By that I mean all those parts of the government and the economy that aren't under democratic control. And of course the Democrats are part of that deep state as well. Now you've developed a new approach to analyzing U.S. hegemony. A taxi driver once told me on the way from John F. Kennedy Airport into Manhattan, very matter-of-factly, the business of the government is business. Is that true? Does Washington act like a monopoly?
Verhält sich Washington wie ein Monopolunternehmen?
USA sind für mich in ihrer
For me, the United States, in its structure and its actions, is like a monopolistic corporation on the world stage. The entire body of the U.S., its economy, military, culture, and politics, behaves toward the rest of the world like a monopoly, similar to what we saw in Europe in extreme form around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Back then, monopolies tried to take over entire states. In several European countries, we had monopolies and capitalists who, in the end, saw no other way out than to push the process of war, which ultimately led to the Second World War.
Den Kriegsprozess, den Zweiten Weltkrieg zu forcieren. Die USA haben meines Erachtens
In my view, the United States holds monopolistic tools through its economic policy, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These are instruments that only the U.S. controls, and they're central to lending money across the world, especially to the global South. The U.S. uses them to try to shape global trade in its own interest. And what we see is a world trade system where the global South is always at a disadvantage compared to the global North, because there's an unequal exchange, raw materials from the South for industrial goods from the North. The policies of the IMF make sure that resource-exporting countries are constantly forced into debt, and that they remain indebted states.
dass sie immer verschuldeten Staaten bleiben. Sie kommen nicht raus aus der Verschuldung. Das ist nicht zufällig.
They can't get out of debt. And that's not by accident, even though they're rich in natural resources. If normal conditions existed on the world market, they could use that wealth to pay off their debts and build their own industries. But they can't, because they remain trapped in a neo-colonial cycle of debt dependency. They're forced to produce more and more raw materials just to earn enough for infrastructure projects and to balance their national budgets. This pressure to increase production means that on the world market, just like with oil, there's always an oversupply of about 5 to 10%.
Überschuss von 5 bis 10% vorhanden ist. Dieser Überschuss wird generiert.
This surplus is generated, so to speak, by IMF policies, by the lending policies of the World Bank and the IMF, so that these countries are forced to produce and bring to market more than the market can actually absorb. That means prices drop below the real value of the goods. No normal state has such an instrument. It has to be a monopolistic state, one that possesses these tools and is able to subject a large part of the world to its own interests. And if I may add, this system of manipulating global trade has led to a yearly redistribution at the expense of the global South and in favor of the global North.
Globalen Nordens stattfindet. Und Wissenschaftler haben versucht,
And scientists have tried to figure this out, because it's always been a huge issue in the economic debate about global trade, especially among those on the left. Two research groups set out to calculate it, to find out just how big this redistribution really is, the one that happens through falling raw material prices, or as I call them, dumping prices. These groups, from the University of Barcelona and the University of Stockholm, found that in 2021, 17 trillion in wealth, purchasing power, money, capital, all of that, was transferred from the global South to the global North. And that amount equals the combined gross domestic product of all EU countries.
Alle EU-Staaten zusammen. Sie sehen, diese monopolistische Institution.
You see, this monopolistic institution is able to provide its allies with significant economic advantages and tell them, I'm your protector. I'll make sure your prosperity keeps growing. I have the means to do that. The IMF and the World Bank are under my control, so I'm the one who can dictate what you have to do. From that relationship, you can also see the way Trump now deals with Europe, with the EU, how dismissive and arrogant he acts toward the EU. Because he can always say, your prosperity depends on the fact that I set the rules that let you take wealth from the global South without anyone noticing.
Ohne dass jemand merkt. Das ist ja das perfide an diesem Problem.
That's exactly what's so insidious about this problem. It's invisible. This redistribution, which is imperialistic and neocolonial, can't be seen. Nobody notices it. You have to analyze it first. I tried to explain that in detail in one of the chapters of my book, but it's really a prime example of the monopolistic nature of the United States as a body in the world. You can't quite call it a foreign body, but it's a huge presence on the planet, one that creates problems, causes wars, and drives poverty and exploitation. It can't go on like this.
Das kann so nicht bleiben.
Also, ich habe verstanden.
So what I've gathered is this. Europeans are allowed to take part, to some extent, in the exploitation of the global South. And the price for that is obedience and loyalty. Is that what you'd call a kind of free-rider imperialism?
Ein Trittbrettfahrer-Imperialismus?
Schöner Begriff. Trittbrettfahrer-Imperialismus.
Nice term. Hitchhiker imperialism. That's a good way to describe it and make it understandable. Yes, I'd say it definitely shows that it's wrong to define all Western countries as equally imperialistic. They're all imperialist states in an economic sense, sure, but there are big differences between the United States and the rest of the imperialist countries. The EU, Japan, Canada, Australia, they're in a position where they believe there's no alternative to U.S. hegemonic power. You can see the same thing within NATO, in the relationship between all NATO members and the United States. These allies have a lot of advantages in terms of energy and so-called security, that supposed security the U.S. has established through what you might call a military definition. Energy security, which is actually kind of redundant.
Was ja eigentlich überflüssig ist, wenn der Welthandel funktionieren würde für
If global trade actually worked, countries wouldn't need energy security. Nobody talks about wheat security or flour security. But when it comes to energy, we do talk about security, because that sector has been militarized by the United States. The arms industry and the oil sector are closely linked through U.S. interests. And in that context, the Western countries that belong to various Western institutions are the ones that accept the rules set by the United States.
Akzeptieren, die USA formulieren. Also dahinter steckt diese Interessen, sogenannte Energie.
So behind all this is the interest in what's called energy security, and above all, the flow of raw materials from all over the world at much lower prices. And that has consequences for the world, for humanity as a whole. The climate problem we're facing is the result of the historical development of U.S. control over the oil sector. I could explain that in more detail another time because it's highly relevant right now why the climate problem came about. It has to do with imperialism, with U.S. hegemony, and a different kind of world could solve that problem.
Eine andere Welt konnte das Problem ohne die US-Hegemonie viel.
I understand, and you analyze this in your book, that the hegemon uses a range of tools to maintain its dominance. One of them is binding itself to vassals, like Israel, which then fight proxy wars on the ground. The second is the exploitation of natural resources. The third is an extreme wage gap compared to the global south. For all of this to work, the military-industrial complex has to be strong. There must always be an ongoing threat scenario, constant armament. Then there's the dollar-based economy, tied to oil, which basically forces everyone to stay within that dollar sphere. So what does that mean for Europe? Can Europe free itself?
Ich glaube ja. Allerdings.
I think so, yes. But only if, at the same time, the People's Republic of China has moved a bit further in developing and shaping a new world order. Europe, the European Union, has the largest internal market in the world, larger than that of the United States or China. But it has little power. The euro could very well become another global currency. And that wouldn't be a bad thing if there were some kind of competition between the euro, the yuan, and the dollar. You could say the world's monetary system would become more democratic through this competition among currencies. It would mean that the United States alone would no longer be able to unilaterally draw capital from all over the world into the U.S., because that would be prevented, blocked, really, by the competition from the yuan and the euro. And the euro could play a very important role alongside the yuan. The euro could take on that role if, at the same time, the EU countries realize that the future of the world lies in the United States losing its hegemony and the European Union gaining more independence, much more independence, not militarily, but politically. That alone would be enough if the US no longer had the same political leverage it has today. They have that leverage because they have the dollar. Because through the dollar, they finance their military bases, 800 or even 1,000 of them, and about $2 trillion a year in total defense spending. If they can no longer finance that, they'll also lose their military power. As the United States loses its military dominance, other blocs like the European Union and China gain more political power. In that sense, we could also see a new United Nations emerge, one where the major blocs, such as India, Russia, China, and the US, work together, and where the UN structure, including the Security Council, evolves in a new direction. Of course, Europe has a chance in this context to become more independent from the United States. But it has to understand that the goal must be to overcome U.S. hegemony. Only through that process can the European Union, as an independent power, preserve and further develop its own system.
Professor Mohssen Massarat says the future of the world depends on the United States losing its hegemonic position. Thank you very much for this conversation. Here at Against the Current, we present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. Stay tuned.
Bleiben Sie dran.